Hello and welcome to the FPL Stats Fix for Game Week 26. My name's Tom Campbell. You can find me on Twitter at UtterlyTC. Now, in this video, what we're going to be looking at is identifying the teams that have been performing best in terms of their form over the recent game weeks and seeing which players from those teams are really piquing our interest. We're also going to then be having a look at the upcoming fixtures. Obviously, it's double game week season, very exciting for us all. And seeing whether or not there are any players from those teams that have those great upcoming fixtures that we can look to target to bring into our teams. This video is coming at you from fantasyfootballfix.com. Please do like and comment on this video. Subscribe to fantasyfootballfix.com. Let's get right into it. Okay, welcome along everyone. Hopefully everyone enjoyed last week's video and hopefully everyone's not too upset and reeling from what was another chastening game week, wasn't it? Goodness me, not many points there, despite our best plans. But we move on. It's obviously double game week season. It's super exciting for us as FPL managers. And fantasyfootballfix.com has got you covered in terms of having the stats that we're going to be taking a look at today to see whether or not there are any players or any teams that we should be looking to target in terms of the upcoming fixtures. So what I thought I would do in this week's video is, to start with, I thought it would be interesting to look at which teams, from a form perspective, have actually been performing best in terms of their overarching results. And then once we've actually identified those teams, drill down into the players from those teams to see which have been kind of performing best in terms of their points returns and expected points returns, before we then actually try and dovetail that and join that up with fixture analysis. So the first part of the video is going to be looking at, which teams have been performing well and seeing players from those teams we may be interested in bringing in. The second part will be looking at the fixtures in terms of which fixtures does fantasyfootballfix.com recommend in terms of teams to target, looking for at players from those teams. And then finally, what we're trying to do there is join the two up. So are there any teams that have been performing well in terms of their recent form, who have great upcoming fixtures, and then really drill down and see whether or not there are any players to target? So that's what we're going to be doing today. So hope you enjoy the video. If you do, smash a like on the video, guys. Do please subscribe to the channel. Do please subscribe to fantasyfootballfix.com if you haven't already. There is a ton of tools that you can have a play with, and I'm just going to be scratching the surface today as we go through that. So the starting point here, and I just want to start by saying that you can see here in terms of the Opta stats sandbox, what I've got actually is a number of teams highlighted. We've actually filtered this already. I've done this preemptively. And these are basically the teams, the 7 teams who have the best recent form. And by recent, I've looked at the last 6 game weeks. And so these are the teams who've actually been consistently performing well in terms of their recent results. So straight away, I think this should tell you that the players from those teams you would be backing to hopefully continue that in terms of their upcoming form. And it's quite interesting, actually. The teams that we're looking at, you can see on screen at the moment: Arsenal, Brighton, Liverpool, Man City, Newcastle, West Ham, and Wolves, respectively. And what I've done is to limit the game week range here. So from game week 23 ongoing. So we're actually not looking at the course of the whole season, because this is more indicative of form. And really what I thought I would do is, now that we've identified these teams, these are the ones, as I say, who have been performing best from a form perspective, we can just look at this from a position by position perspective. So depending on where you're at, in terms of which transfers you're looking to target, guys, you might be interested in, for example, goalkeepers. Now, not the most exciting or sexy position, I think we'd all agree, but straight away there are some interesting findings here. So on the right hand side of the screen here, I'm just going to scroll down to there are a few more players for you to consider here. But obviously at the top, I have filtered this on points in terms of how they have performed over that recent game week period. And you can see Aaron Ramsdale here is the standout. 5.1 million is not super expensive. And Martin Dubravka is a name who we wouldn't have given the time of day to prior to the recent improvement for Newcastle United. But straight away you can see there at 4.4 million, Martin Dubravka might present somebody sort of interesting option there. I'm just going to have a look at the expected FPL points as well and filter that there. And Dubravka's still right at the sort of just behind Ramsdale there. So depending on your budget there, that might be an interesting option actually. At 5.6, sort of rounded up to 6 points per game week. Obviously, that would be a clean sheet with no bonus or save points, but it's somebody who's going to be a huge differential and someone who'd be potentially right under the radar there. And this is the sort of thing that the Opta Stats Sandbox can really help uncover. So two names there to think about would be Aaron Ramsdale and Martin Dubravka. Obviously, the names of Alisson and Edison are going to be more typical. Jose Sarr and Sanchez, names we've talked about already. But I did find that super interesting in terms of Ramsdale and Dubravka, respectively. If we move on now and take a look at defenders, and I'm going to filter this on expected FPL points. And again, I should have said, sorry guys, as per last week as well, I filtered these on per game rather than total, because I think that does help contextualize it quite nicely. So the name here, and this is when I was doing the prep for the video, Gabriel is someone who I would not necessarily have thought of there. Like they've not played a ton of games over this period and their fixture congestion will follow. 5.3 million is an interesting price. It's not super expensive, but Gabriel with an expected FPL points returns of over 9 per game. Now, you wouldn't reasonably expect that every game, but in terms of a predictive element there, super exciting. And again, someone I wouldn't necessarily have thought of there. So straight away, you can see how these stats are really helping to identify some really interesting differentials there. Nathan Ake, I wouldn't necessarily recommend. He played well in the last game against Norwich, and Pep was very favourable in his assessment after the game. But you know, with the likes of Emerick Laporte, Ruben Diaz, you've also got John Stones in the mix, Cancelo. There are lots of different options there for Pep to choose from. So I wouldn't necessarily be recommending Nathan Ake. The likes of Webster and White, for example, though, at this price point of 4.4 and 4.5 million, respectively, it just gives an indication in terms of if you're looking for enabling players at different low price points, then Fix has got you covered. It's suggesting that their expected FPL points over that period are over 6 and 7, respectively. So names again to think about. Now, obviously, this is not looking at fixtures. We'll come on to that in a moment. But in terms of players who've been expected to have returned well over the previous period that we've been looking at, game week 23 onwards, then those are some really interesting names that you might not have considered. Let's move on and take a look at the midfielders now. I'm just going to keep the filter on expected FPL points. So we can look at points as well, but probably less differentials here. But the likes, or the name Raheem Sterling, obviously he's coming off the back of a hat-trick despite that missed penalty in the game against Norwich, and he is premium option there at 10.7 million. But probably someone who's not necessarily been in everyone's thoughts, guys, actually, in terms of accommodating that Man City player in the team. You know, it's so difficult to predict where those points are coming from. But Raheem Sterling, once again, he's found himself back into Pep's good books. He's playing on that left-hand side of the attack. And as and when he's selected, he's returning great points. Fabinho is really interesting, isn't he? I saw a stat that he's outscored Cristiano Ronaldo in 2022. You know, read into that what you would like. But at 5.4 million, goodness me, guys, that would be a differential potentially worth considering. I'm not super enthused by that. I do think that's a bit of an anomaly. But, you know, it's the sort of thing that you can't argue with the actual expected FPL returns in that time, guys. But certainly Raheem Sterling jumping out there. You've got your premium options here of Kevin De Bruyne and Sadio Mane, who's back from the AFCON now as well. But just sort of going down a little bit now into the stats here. I've set this, guys, as well to be return lots of different names here, so you can actually widen that on Fix if you want to. But these are some names who you might be interested in looking at. So Gerard Bowen, obviously, I suspect will be in a lot of people's teams. I think we mentioned Moutinho last week as well, and it's a name who I wouldn't necessarily always think of from an FPL perspective. But 4.9 million, guys, is a price that you can't really argue about. And, you know, he's been expected to return significant points over the last several game weeks. So some interesting names there. Moving on to the forwards, which has been an absolute nightmare, guys, hasn't it, in terms of trying to find any player who would return and not eat up all of your budget there. So I'm not expecting this to be massively indicative of returning you a great amount of points, because it is an absolute dearth, isn't it, guys? And similarly, and you know, sure enough, these are not names who are massively excited about. Alexander Lacazette, Raul Jimenez, Alan St-Maximin. I'd say Alan St-Maximin is more encouraging because of Newcastle's upswing in recent performance there, and his price is attractive there at 6.9 million. But you can see how these numbers differ from those that we've looked at already. Much lower. Look, it's a tough slot. It's a shame we have to pick three, isn't it? But we do have to, and there are some names there, guys, who you might be interested in. I would be saying that Alan St-Maximin would be the one who would kind of leap out at me from that perspective. So some interesting names there, guys, in terms of players across the different positions in terms of how they've performed over the last handful of game weeks. Now, I said in the introduction, guys, that we would also, of course, be looking at our fixture analysis as well. Now, we know the fixture analyzer on fantasyfootballfix.com is super helpful in terms of you can specify the game week range here. You can exclude game weeks if you want to, which actually becomes really an interesting function of the feature, actually, in terms of game weeks that might include a whole bunch of blanks, for example. Like we know that that is the case in game week 27 for some, to 26, excuse me. It's ones that you might want to do, and clearly as we go through the rest of the season, that will become more relevant, I would say. What I've done here is just to specify the next 3 game weeks, although game week 26, excuse me, is of course a nice double game week. I'm sure we're all excited about to have our hearts broken once again. So game week 26 through game week 29, guys. I've got this as attack difficulty to start with here. And my analysis is going to focus in the same way that the first half looked at the top 7 teams. I'm going to focus in on the top 7 teams in terms of what Fix is saying are the teams to target from a fixture perspective. So Burnley, Southampton, Leeds, Wolves, Liverpool, Watford and Arsenal. Some really interesting teams there that we wouldn't necessarily be focused in at. And clearly we've just looked at it from a form perspective. And there wasn't actually a massive crossover there. There was a crossover, and we will come on to that in the final part of the video. But those are the teams, guys, that we're going to be looking at. And you can sort of see why Fix is outlining the positive nature of Burnley, for example. They've not been in great form, as we know. But look, the sheer number of games that they've got upcoming is what's going to be attractive from selecting them. Southampton, much improved level of performance here. They had a terrific week, didn't they, after beating Tottenham impressively and then acquitting themselves really positively against Man United as well. And, you know, the other teams as well, sort of jumping out from a fixture perspective, you wouldn't necessarily have identified. So I did find that really interesting as well. And it's going to be the same approach now, guys. So going back into the Opta Sandbox here, and I've set this up again. So the same teams that I just mentioned in terms of having those great fixtures. Again, I'm looking at how they've performed recently because I think that's more indicative of their current form. And we're just going to go through again position by position. So let's get right into it. And, you know, clearly Arsenal were one of those teams that crossed over. Let's look at points rather than expected to start with. Ramsdale, we've already talked about there, and Jose Sarr as well. So those are the names, I would say, in terms of if you're looking at goalkeepers from an upcoming fixtures perspective. And this is where you get that lovely crossover, guys, in terms of recent performance at a team level that we looked at in the first half of the video and those upcoming fixtures. So Aaron Ramsdale really identifying himself there, and 5.1 million, guys, is a really great price point there. So I won't belabor that point too much further. I think he's the standout from my analysis. Moving on to look at defenders. And again, we're going to focus in on no. Let's look at expected points here rather than points. Now, clearly, the Liverpool guys are going to be ones that are going to be sort of front of mind in terms of players who you'd already be targeting, probably likely got in your squads already. And this just kind of backs that up in terms of Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson, respectively. But again, there's our man, Gabriel, that we talked about previously, 5.3 million. You've got Kieran Tierney as well, who we mentioned in last week's video as well. Joel Matip, I think it gets more difficult to justify that as an inclusion in terms of your Liverpool contingent there. Semedo, a name I wouldn't necessarily have thought of, at 4.8 million, and a similar projected or expected points returns, I should say, in terms of, you know, peers like Van Dijk and Joel Matip. So those are names who are kind of leaping out at me, but I really like this Gabriel suggestion here in terms of a defender to potentially target if you're looking at making a defensive transfer for game week 26. Moving on to look at the midfield. And let's look at points. Mo Salah is a name that will be on everyone's lips. I'm sure heaps of managers are super excited about the prospect of triple captaincy in double game week 26. I suspect that's going to be a chip that is going to be played by an awful lot of managers. And in terms of the analysis to back up that assertion that a double game week of Leeds and Norwich is something that you want to get behind, where you've also got the statistical backing for that, should you wish to do that, in terms of the expected FPL points returns over the last few game weeks and the actual points returns as well. Diego Jota had a dead leg, which ruled him out of training prior to the Burnley game, so he was on the bench in that game. Super frustrating for the owners. Not a lot you could have done about that. But there's still a lot of faith there in terms of how he's performed recently. Sadio Mane, similarly. Quite an interesting one in terms of Emil Smith-Rowe as well. Expected minutes would be the question mark there. I'm just going to make sure that we're actually going to reduce this back down to make sure that the filter is set to game week 23. Apologies, guys. I think I'd probably done that incorrectly prior to setting up the video. Let's look at expected FPL points returns as well. Yeah, that was my bad, actually, guys. So I hadn't set the filter up correctly. So let's just recount this a little bit. So expected FPL returns, Fabinho, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my reluctance for Fabinho is going to be proved to be incorrect. But, he plays sort of that defensive midfielder role, certainly central midfield role. Like, wonderful player, but not necessarily one that I would be excited about. And here's the Sadio Mane inclusion that I did in my prep beforehand, and almost 7 points a game. Great differential, quite hard to justify at that 11.7 million. But if, for example, you're using a free hit for double game week 26, which I'm sure some managers will be doing, it might be one under the radar. And look, Moutinho, again, we mentioned him in the form analysis as well, 4.9 million. Really interesting name there, guys. So just going to scroll down so you get a little bit more of a visual aid here in terms of some of the midfielders who've been high in terms of the expected FPL points returns over that period. And if I filter on actual points, goodness me, Moutinho again there. Some really interesting names, guys. I just found that really interesting in terms of the upcoming fixtures. We know we can back them because of the fix algorithm suggesting that these are the teams to target and be confident about from an attack perspective. So there are some names there that you might be interested to target. Look, we need to devote some time, don't we, to the forwards. We've got to pick three, as I said, which is not something that any of us want to do, I'm sure, but we have to. So may as well get on with it. Look, Che Adams here is a name that leapt out at me when I was doing the analysis before. Played well in the game that against Man United in game week 25. Took his goal excellently against David De Gea. So he's kind of been identified there. 6.8 million is in that price range that was comparable with Alanson Maximin, who we know from a Fawn perspective. So an interesting kind of quandary there in terms of whether or not you target the fixture or whether or not you target how the team has performed recently. But there are some names here who you might be interested in. Weghorst, I know, is still currently battling an injury concern that we need some clarity on there, guys. So just be cautious in relation to getting too excited about the Burnley upcoming double game weeks there. We need to make sure that he is good to go. Jay Rodriguez might be the benefactor from that if that should play out. But yeah, from a points return perspective for forwards, it's not great, guys. There's nothing we can do to really sugarcoat that, I'm afraid. So what I wanted to do in the closing section of the video here is effectively what I did here is to look at where we had a crossover from the first half of the video, which was looking at which teams have performed really well over the last 6 game weeks. And we had a look at the players from those teams. Then also to align that with the teams who have got great fixtures and see in terms of a then what the crossover was. And it's just these 3 teams, guys. So I've created here in the custom stats builder on fantasyfootballfix.com, which is an awesome tool where you can build your own bespoke tables here. I've created a bespoke table here, players to target for the next 4 based on the output from their previous 4. And those teams are Arsenal, Liverpool and Wolves respectively. And then I've just pulled out a whole host of stats here, guys. in terms of ones that I think would actually be quite predictive in terms of how they've actually performed and hopefully inform how they're going to perform. So a whole bunch of attacking stats here. And look at that. I swear I didn't set this up beforehand in Blue Peter fashion in terms of Gabriel being at the top there. But hey, maybe he's the name for the video that we should be focused on. I've set this to averages per game rather than totals as well. And we'll just have a little play around now to see whether or not anything is leaping out at us. If we look at attempted assists, which is something that I quite like. This is something that fantasyfootballfix.com has got as part of its suite of stats that you can include in your tables as you create them, rather than the expected assist, which is something more sort of widely available in mainstream media. But expected assists of 3 per game. Odegaard is a really interesting name there in that midfield for Arsenal. Andy Robertson, more than 2 attempted assists per game. That's fab from a defensive perspective. Let's scroll down so there are some more names, guys, for you to start getting your thinking caps on and to start potentially be looking to target. So again, I filtered this on attempted assists. Expected assists is going to be less, of course, because that relies on the actual subsequent chance and the likelihood of that being scored from. But maybe I'm wrong to be dispelling Lacazette here. We shall see. But Andy Robertson, again, super impressive, along with Trent Alexander-Arnold. And that's interesting. Gabriel from an attacking perspective as well. So not just that defensive output, guys, but potentially there is some attacking threat as well. Expected FPL points is what we were looking at previous. We know Gabriel, Fabinho, Ben White, etc. are going to be there. Ben White as well, 4.5 million. Really interesting price point there, guys, to potentially look as an enabler and a budget option. I'm actually going to look now at the shots or expected goals, I should say. So the actual nitty gritty of are these players expecting to score? So look at that. Maybe I'm wrong to be downplaying Fabinho, but 5.4 million, guys. The stats are suggesting that his expected goals over the last 4 game weeks have been really impressive there. Raul Jimenez as well. We know Wolves as a fixtures, as I said, are positive. Gabriel remains positive, so definitely the standout name from today's video. And just to close off, let's look at the just pure number of shots. So Jota, goodness me, disappointing he didn't start against Burnley, wasn't it, guys? But should be back in contention for the upcoming fixtures, and no reason to doubt that he will continue to be a great asset ongoing. So that about covers it for today's FPL Stats Fix video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Do please get down into the comments below and let me know what you liked about this video, whether or not it's been helpful. Do please smash a like on the video as well. Subscribe to fantasyfootballfix.com. Subscribe to the fantasyfootballfix.com YouTube channel. Give me a follow on Twitter @utterlytc, and I will see you in the next video. Take it easy.